When to take action and when to wait. That's the question we're looking at today. Now, picture this. There's something you greatly desire. Now, whether it's a dream, whatever, that's really not the important part. But what if the opportunity came up for you to get it? Finally, and you've waited a long time. Do you take it? Do you take that opportunity? What if it means taking matters into your own hands? What if it means taking a shortcut? What if it's something you absolutely know God wants for you? Better yet, what if others recognize this, what God wants for you, and urge you to take advantage of the opportunity? Do we take action, or are we content to wait for God? Life, society, the world we live in would tell us you have to grab every opportunity or it may never come again. But in reality, the secret to a God-powered life is as we learn more and more to rely on God's direction and His timing. Now, in reality, that's a lot easier said than done. In the moment, it's so difficult sometimes to tell God it seems like maybe this is you. We're going to look at a story today, which I love, and there's a key truth here that you and I need to grasp for us to live that God-powered life. And often, people pursue those dreams and desires. They get ahead of God, and in doing so, they get out of His timing. And what they receive just doesn't have, it never reaches its full potential. So we're looking in 1 Samuel 26. Now here's the setting, the story. David, what's happened? Now, God has already anointed him a long time ago, told him he was going to be king. So right out of the gate, we already know what God's will is. What we don't know is the timing. Now, we had previously seen where Saul pursued David. David cut the hem off of his robe, a corner, and he immediately felt guilty because this was the Lord's anointed. I can't violate that. But now in this scenario, what happened? So Saul is pursuing David, and it's nighttime, and Saul, now this is really cool, Saul is asleep, and he's surrounded by his warriors sleeping. So David goes down into the camp, and Abishai goes with him. Now, there's a good and a bad sometimes to our friends, those who are loyal to us. It's positive. It's amazing to get that encouragement that again, you're walking right into the enemy's camp, right in the middle of them. And Abishai's, I'll go with you. So there's a positive, but we also have to be willing to, when our friends are urging us, we need to be able to step above that and to recognize, okay, is this God or not? And we'll see that in a moment. So they go into, so imagine this, a ring of warriors. And Saul is in the middle, and they walk right in. Now, later in 1 Samuel 26, it says because God put them into a deep sleep. So you arrive right into the center. Now, let's recap. You know God has said you're to be king. On top of that, you have done this amazing thing and walked right into the center of the camp among the sleeping warriors. It's obvious God is protecting you. And Saul's spear is right there beside him. It could easily look like God has created the opportunity for you to achieve and receive what He has for you. Now, it gets better, though, because now then Abishai whispers to him, this is it. Surely God has delivered him into your hand. This is it. So again, you know it's God's will for you to be king. You have been pursued. You have been victimized. He has tried to kill you for ages. And God has delivered him into your hand a second time. Okay, God, maybe you're trying to tell me something. And now you have a friend who is loyal to you, urging you, surely this is God. But why was David a man after God's own heart? Well, he recognized for him to take action, for him to receive this, meant violating one of God's principles. And he says, you can't be found innocent if you harm the Lord's anointed. See, he recognized that to take a shortcut to receive his kingdom, God couldn't bless that. And that's one of the reasons he was a man after God's own heart. And we're going to come back to that thought. But here's how committed David was. So here's your dream. You're making the decision that, God, I'm waiting on you. I'm going to be content to wait on your timing. And he goes even further. So they get out of the camp. He calls out, wakes up Saul. Saul calls out, "Is this you?" And he says something profound. He says, "Yes, my Lord, the king." See, David is to be the king, but what does he do? He proclaims Saul as his Lord and the king. And what's he doing? He's effectively delaying and deferring his rise, his kingship, to God's hands. He is not saying, "You're king until I get it." Nothing. What does he do? He recognizes Saul as king. And in doing so, he is content to wait. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but what's he doing? He's waiting for God to be the one to make this happen. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at why God does these things. Why do we have to wait? Why is it, Lord, that the thing you have for me, the things in my heart, it just so often feels like, God, the longer we wait, how much we're missing out on. Surely you couldn't want us to wait longer. Well, David not only says, "My Lord, the king," but he goes on and calls him, "You are the Lord's anointed." But then he says something profound. He says, God has a special blessing for those who are loyal. He recognizes that, you know what, I'm going to let God bless me rather than taking matters into my own hands. Now, these are not just simple stories for us just to enjoy, but frankly, there's so much for us here. David waited so long for him to receive what God not only had for him, but had promised him. Why do we wait? See, Saul got the kingdom quickly, and he was a failure. He didn't pursue God. But David, he waited years. But see, what God wanted was more than David to be king. He wanted David to continue to develop as that man we know as a man after God's own heart. But on top of that, in the end, he earned an eternal reward. He is not only probably the most famous king in all of the world, but the Messiah came from his bloodline, that he would have a descendant on the throne forever. It's so tempting so often for us to try to take action, to shake things up, make something happen, that we would move forward, that we could move into what God has for us. But we have to learn so much more about being content and waiting on God. Why? Because it's not about giving up. But God is at work. While we're waiting, God is developing the man and woman of God that's inside of each one of us. He does have so much more for us. But how we receive it is not by going out, making things happen, taking matters into our own hands. Worse, taking shortcuts. One profound truth is, if it requires you and I to take a shortcut. Now, by a shortcut, I'm talking about, okay, God, but it's achieving your plan. Anytime we have to do that, maybe there's a little white lie involved to get the agenda forward. Anytime we have to do anything like that would violate one of God's principles, violate His word, God can't honor that. One of the things we see so often is those who are God's people, but they don't understand this principle. They work so hard to make things happen, to push their agenda. And then the reality is the thing that is birthed doesn't have the power that it needs. It may start out and seem to have a bit of momentum, but then quickly peters out. Why? Because it was what we built in our strength. And God's not glorified in that. What was God doing? All those years on the run, all those years of waiting, all the time that seemed wasted, God was developing David. And in doing so, he did become a man after God's own heart. He became probably the most amazing king ever. those times when we're waiting, those times when we are learning to be content to wait on God, that's when God is developing the man and woman of God inside of each one of us. And in doing so, then He can move through us in His power. He's glorified. And we receive the blessings, the benefits of it. But it's about us learning to trust Him, rely on Him, be content in Him. And when those opportunities come up, how do we evaluate them? Well, it's not as easy, but an easy one is to say, look, do I have to cut corners? Do I have to take matters into my own hand to make things happen? If so, it's not God. And in waiting, even though it may seem like we're wasting time, we're losing out, God can do something amazing. So, do we take matters into our own hand, or do we learn to be content and allow God to be the one to move the agenda forward?